Okay, so I would like to start maybe with a more, broad question, asking how are EU-Russia relations viewed in Moscow? Um, how are they understood in general?
Well, there is quite a complicated question, starting from the problem of what do we mean when we are talking about Moscow? Do you mean the official level of Russian foreign policy? Then the latest official discourse puts it very overtly. How does Russia see the relations between Moscow and Brussels? The relations are in crisis, and as Foreign Minister Lavrov said, there are no political dialogue or any relationship between Russia and the EU as an organization. But following the same argument, it is worth paying attention to another statement of Foreign Minister Lavrov when he said that we should not confuse the EU with Europe. And then repeatedly he continued that even if we do not have relations with the EU, Russia has good, better, worse, but still good relations with different EU member states, with different European countries. And I would say that this is the current position of Russian foreign policy that derives from the problem of self-identification vis-à-vis the European Union and vis-à-vis Europe in general. There is an article of Vladimir Baranovsky, who is also the member of the board committee. The article is entitled Russia a part of Europe or apart from Europe. And I would say that that is the main dilemma of Russia in general and Russia's relations with the EU, how to position itself in the situation when politically Europe is subordinate to the idea of the European integration and of the European Union, while culturally, geographically, economically, emotionally, Russia is a part of Europe. And it is apart from the European Union and the political process within the European integration. And so unless Russia finds the instruments of dealing with problem, and the European Union from its side too, the relations are in crisis. So we have to really distinguish ourselves in order to find a new modus operandi in the relations.
So the EU has also probably been trying to rethinking itself, and one of the ways it was rethinking itself was this idea of becoming a geopolitical union in terms of foreign relations. And the concept of strategic autonomy was also very popular and high on the agenda of the foreign policymakers. So how does this approach, how is Russia, Moscow, how do they view this approach? Do they want a geopolitical European Union? How do they understand a geopolitical European Union?
Well, in fact, I would say that Russia is very welcoming to the idea of the strategic autonomy of the European Union and of the potentially geopolitical European Union. Because from Russian perspective, the geopolitical European Union would mean that the EU does not use this value-based and norms-based approach in any occasion, and that it would be possible to cooperate on the pragmatic basis, talking only about pragmatic interests and in the spheres of mutual benefit. And the same is true for the strategic autonomy. Russian official discourse on the very high level always supports the idea of independent European Union. And it may be put more or less overt in terms of the official discourse, but in Russia, the European Union is still considered to be dependent on the United States, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of some important foreign policy decisions. I think that everybody knows what are the main points where we may discuss the dependency of the European Union, or at least how Russia sees it. So the strategic autonomy of the European Union, again, is welcomed by Russia. But the problem is that this perception of geopolitical foreign policy is not necessarily shared by the European Union itself. So we have different perceptions on the geopolitics. That's why we still have to wait some period of time where there is a sort of a fixed perception from both sides. How do we see each other and not only mutually, but ourselves in this changing world politics.
You have already mentioned the statement by Minister Lavrov on the relations with the European Union, that they're really at sort of bottom, have hit a new bottom, and the same has been said also in the European Union, especially after High Representative Borrell visit to Moscow. So in this situation, what would you say can be a realistic goal for Russia-EU relations?
Well, if I knew that for sure, I think I could have worked much closer to our foreign policy minister than I am now. I think it's a real problem of the realistic vision of the near future. But there are still some areas where Russia and the European Union are bound to cooperate, or to try to find some instruments for cooperation. There are different positions of the EU and Russia in these areas. For example, if we are to talk about the Green Deal and the ecological agenda in the relations between Russia and the EU, it is considered to be mutually binding because Russia and the EU are still very interdependent in terms of energy cooperation. But it demands from Russia rather an amount of efforts if we want to continue the constructive and beneficial dialogue with the EU, because being a producer country of hydrocarbons, the ecological agenda is present in Russia's domestic politics, but not to the level that would be influential in our dialogue with the European Union. There are also, of course, the issues of different regional security problems where Russia is very present and plays an important role, and this role may be of interest for the future development of the European Union, taking again into consideration the fact that Russia is a security actor while the European Union has a different type of instruments in terms of providing the security. Near East, Syria, all these issues that are on the political agenda, and the migration problem that will or is considered to arise in a short-term perspective for the European Union again, when the pandemic regime in Europe and worldwide will become less strict, and the migration flows will reappear on the political agenda, and thus again the security cooperation between the EU and Russia, or Russia and the West in general, will again play an important role for their mutual agendas. But again, referring back to the official discourse in Russia in terms of Russia-EU state of relations and the problems of redefining them, I think that it is difficult precisely in terms of the conceptualization. So no one knows what would be the goal. So we are in the legacy of the previous goal setting, when the EU and Russia were still thinking about some togetherness, and currently we do not see the common future, and that's the main problem.
So maybe another area where the European Union and Russia have sort of a strong interest is their common neighborhood. So the countries, or somehow they're called, sometimes they're called countries in between, right? And so there were many conflicts recently that have been happening in these countries, and sooner or later they, gained this geopolitical dimension. So they were, the European Union was involved, Russia was involved, or sometimes also caused them, as also they argue in the European Union very often. So what do you see, how do you see this relationship develop in this space? Maybe some overall trends, if you can suggest.
Well, it is, again, it is a very complicated question, because we see that there are completely diverging approaches to the substance of what's happening in the shared neighborhood. So we do not agree on not only on Russia's behavior or on the European Union behavior, but also we do not agree on the substance of the domestic processes in the states of the shared neighborhood. So talking about the multilateral formats that were tried to be settled, like the Normandy 4, we see that they also reflect this crisis of understanding and of the absence of mutual approaches to the issues that are of mutual concern. And that's the paradox. When we started to analyze and to talk about the shared neighborhood in the beginning of the 2000s, the problem was that these countries are of mutual concern for Russia and for the European Union, as they are our common neighbors. And we ended up with a complete split in understanding of what has been happening in these countries. But what else seems to me important is that the substance of change in these countries may not necessarily be covered by the efforts nor of the European Union, neither of Russia. What I try to say. If we look at what had happened in South Caucasus in autumn, we see that it is not only the deterioration of the security context, but it is also the appearance of other actors that were not present in the region in the previous 30 years, namely Turkey. And we see that the formats that were established and where Russia and the West in general and European states were present and agreed on some important issues, and namely Minsk Group, they are not relevant to the regional situation at all. That's why we witness the drastic shifts in the regional environment. And nor the European Union, neither Russia, even if to a lesser extent, are not really ready for these domestic changes. And both the European Union and Russia have to adjust their politics to what is happening in the region. Russia is closer and obviously and naturally more present and more influential in the region, but it's already settled politics in the region suffers from the changes that are happening.
So let me also ask you a short question about Ukraine, maybe a more current one. So recently we heard news that Russia is moving its troops to the Ukrainian border. And of course, this news very much alarmed many in Europe. Would you say that a hot conflict in eastern Ukraine possible? How can de-escalation be achieved?
Well, as far as Russian troops are concerned, Foreign Policy Minister has commented on that, saying that this is Russian territory, and Russian troops are in their right to move through the territory. I can't comment nor on his statement, neither on the event itself, as I did not witness it with my eyes, so I do not know if what is reported is the real fact. As far as your question about the possibility of the new wave of confrontation, I would say that it is possible, as the situation in general is really very unstable and uncertain and dependent on a lot of factors, from the Ukrainian side, from the side of the United States, and there is quite a lot of analysis about who would be interested in the escalation. But moving to your question about the de-escalation, I would say that only the mutual dialogue, not in terms of finding consensus, but in terms of informing and trying to clear up the signals, only that may calm the current state of situation. Because the misinterpretation of signals is considered to be one of the main reasons for any type of escalation, and it is applicable to the current state of situation in Ukraine.
So the European Union, also the United States, also imposed and maintained a sanctions regime again on Russia in connection with the events in Ukraine. So would you say overall, maybe, I don't know, the very obvious question is, does it work? Do the sanctions work? How does Russia perceive them? And also
how the sanctions work depends on the goal setting of those who imply sanctions. So what is the ultimate goal of the European Union and the United States? As far as we both can assess, if the goal would be to promote some important domestic change in Russia, the previous 6 years of sanctions regime did not have any visible result. Of course, the sanctions influence Russia's development, economic development, and in the long term, I think that their impact is more important than in the short-term perspective. I think that they somehow influence the political structure, even if we do not necessarily see this influence of sanctions. But if we are to analyze the current state of assessment of the sanctions regime in general and of the recent sanctions that were introduced, I would say that the main idea is that if the sanctions are symbolic, then they are not harmful for Russian economic or political development. If they are harmful, then they have the double effect, and then the European Union and the United States, but for less extent, mainly the European Union, would also suffer from the harmful sanctions on Russia. That's why I would say that Russian political and economic systems are somehow adjusted to the sanctions regime and have managed to find the substitution and perceive sanctions as just in the context of the political crisis.
So maybe one last question to sum up our discussion. Like taking into account everything that we've said, what advice would you give to the European policymakers about their the bloc's Russia policy now that they're trying to rethink it and reformulate it? Where should they focus on?
Well, I'm not in the position to advise to any politician, and especially to the European Union decision makers. But just my perception of the problem of the European Union policy towards Russia is that the European Union still waits for some other Russia. And the problem is that Russia doesn't seem to really change, not in 5 or 10 years, but in general, taking its position in global politics, in history, taking its territory, taking its strive for status, whatever. I may be accused in some determinism in this assessment of Russia's politics. But if we are talking about some pragmatism and some way out from the current crisis, then I would say that it may be useful to try to understand what is now and not to try to change and to impose something on any subject of international relations. And what is maybe even more important in this very context is that the global politics in general is moving towards this type of relations. Every actor is closing within itself the period of 1990s with this boom of liberalism and this idea of the general move towards the democratic future is more or less closed, and everyone has to adjust to another global system of international relations, and not only Russia and not only the European Union. So if we try to circle it up, and if we are really talking about the geopolitical European Union, then maybe it's worth being really geopolitical.